Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I've got another true crime video for you all. So I'm going to say this again in case you didn't see my last video, but I am going to be doing more commentary and history and true crime on this channel as it is my key interest and it works my brain a little bit more. It feels like I'm doing more. So yes, I am hoping to bring in a new audience and yeah, I'm very excited about this new little step. I will be doing my hauls and stuff and vlogs, don't you worry guys. And you can just decide what you want to watch, you know? But today we are doing a true crime case and please subscribe, like and comment down below. Comment, let's discuss the case once you've watched. I'm really intrigued. I love reading your comments. They mean the world to me, trust me. I love seeing people's opinions, good or bad. Let's just start. Today's case is on Susan Smith, a mum who did the unthinkable to her two sons. Heavy warning. This is including children, this case, and it's very, very disturbing. If you don't want to listen to that, please don't watch, click out. I don't want to make you upset in any way. Susan Lee Vaughan, I can't say her name, anyway, was born on September 26th, 1971 in Union, South Carolina. To parents Linda, a homemaker, and Harry, a firefighter who later worked in one of the textile mills that surrounded Union. A bit on her parents. So in 1960, Harry was 20 and Linda was 17 and was actually already pregnant from a previous relationship when the two got married. Together, Harry and Linda had a son named Scotty and then a daughter named Susan. And obviously they had Linda's son from that previous relationship, but he raised this other son as his own. He was called Michael. Harry and Linda's marriage had many conflicts and some of those conflicts escalated to a point where Harry would become violent and threaten to kill Linda and then himself. Harry's violence was the result of his alcoholism and he had this obsession that Linda was being unfaithful. During Susan's early childhood, her home life was very dysfunctional. The turmoil in the household caused Susan and her older brother Scotty to be very frightened of the behaviour of their parents towards one another. Before Susan entered preschool, her half-brother Michael tried to commit suicide by hanging himself. Michael was treated at Duke University Medical Center and at other treatment centres during Susan's childhood. As a result of her turbulent home life, Susan was obviously an unhappy child. The mother of one of her playmates described Susan as unusual and sad. She would just stare into space like she wasn't there. Although Susan was a sad child, she was especially close to her father and would light up whenever Harry was around. In 1977, after 17 years of marriage, Linda divorced Harry. Susan was only 6 years old. Harry was devastated by this divorce and he began to drink heavily as he was so depressed. On January 15th, 1978, 5 weeks after Harry and Linda's divorce became final, Susan's father, Harry, commits suicide. The suicide was preceded by an argument that Harry and Linda had that escalated and forced Linda to call the police. While the police officers arrived at Linda's house, they saw Harry strike Linda. The police report also noted that Harry had broken a window to gain entry into Linda's house. After the police came to Linda's home, Harry apparently feared that he would hurt someone and appealed to one of the police officers to take him to court so that he could have himself jailed. But that didn't happen. Anyway, I don't know why, but Harry committed suicide by placing a gun between his legs and aiming the gun at his abdomen. Harry then pulled the trigger, obviously fatally wounding himself, but he did not die immediately. Harry called 911 himself for assistance and was rushed to the hospital, but emergency surgery could not save his life and Harry, at 37 years old, was dead. Harry's suicide left a huge void on Susan's life. During her childhood, Susan would treasure two possessions: Harry's coin collection and a tape recording of his voice. 2 weeks after Linda's divorce from Harry became final, she actually married another man called Beverly, better known as Bev. Russell, a well-to-do businessman who owned an appliance store in downtown Union. Bev had been previously married and had several daughters from his first marriage, and he was also a member of the advisory board of the Christian Coalition. After her mother's remarriage, Susan and her brothers moved away from their early childhood modest home outside of Union into Bev's 3-bedroom home in the exclusive Mount Vernon estate section of Union. Susan would then begin to be sexually abused for years by her stepfather, and as a result she began to suffer from depression, and she actually attempted to take her own life at age 13, which is so sad. Susan's stepfather Beverly actually admitted to this sexual abuse later on, and he said that Susan was 16 at the time when this took place and that it was consensual. Okay, we're gonna get into more of that, but I just need to put that in here. Susan did well in school. Throughout her elementary, junior and high school years, she excelled. While she was in high school, she was a member of the Beta Club, a club for students that were achieving a B or above. She also was a member of the Math, Spanish and Red Cross clubs. Susan volunteered in Union's annual Special Olympics and worked with the elderly. She was named president of the Junior Civitan Club, a high school club that performed volunteer work in the community. And from 1986 to 1988, Susan and her best friend Donna Garner volunteered as candy stripers at Wallace Thompson Hospital in Union. So she seemed great at this point. Obviously probably not because of her home life, but she was doing well in other aspects. During Susan's senior years of high school in 1989, she was actually voted friendliest female at her high school. Her classmates remembered her as cheerful and down to earth. She was outgoing, but this only was to mask her insecurity and burning need for male attention. Despite Susan's record of achievement and her image as a model daughter and friend, Susan's life was filled with turmoil. Much of it obviously came from her relationship with her stepfather. Over the years, Bev's attention and approval became increasingly important to Susan, and she found herself competing with her mother for his attention. In 1987, when Susan was about to celebrate her 16th birthday, one of Bev's daughters from his previous marriage stayed overnight in their home. The daughter was given Susan's bedroom and Susan was to sleep on the sofa downstairs. When Susan was ready to go to sleep, Bev was sitting at one end of the sofa. Rather than ask Bev to move, Susan crawled into Bev's lap and began to fall asleep. It was like this 15-year-old was acting like a 2-year-old, but Susan probably thought this behaviour was harmless. I mean, we're not really sure, to be honest. Bev, on the other hand, seemed to feel that Susan's behaviour was provocative. Susan fell asleep, but gradually awoke to the awareness of Bev's hand moving slowly yet firmly from her shoulder to her breasts. Bev then took Susan's hand and placed it directly on his genitals. Susan pretended to be asleep while the molestation took place. She later told her mother that she did not object to Bev's behaviour because she wanted to see how far he would go. Clearly, her response was very inappropriate. I mean, she'd been through a lot. Susan filed a complaint against Bev that was investigated by the South Carolina Department of Social Services and the Union County Sheriff's Office. Linda contacted Susan's guidance counsellor and obtained the name of a family counsellor. Bev, Linda and Susan only went for family counselling 4 or 5 times before stopping them. While the matter was being investigated, Bev agreed to move out of the family home, but he returned a short time after. I don't know why this was not investigated properly. The family seemed to blame Susan as much as they blamed Bev. The family was concerned that stories about the sexual abuse would spread in the community, and they blamed Susan for worsening the situation by making it public and reporting it to the Department of Social Services. I can't believe her mother did this. It's just crazy. In February 1988, Susan was 17 and sought out her high school guidance counsellor, Camille Stribling, for advice. Susan told her that her stepfather had been molesting her for a while. Camille was required by law to report the sexual abuse allegations to the social services. An official in that department then called the police. Susan's mum, Linda, told officials from the sheriff's office that when she confronted Bev, he did not deny this incident. They then sent a caseworker to interview Susan and Susan's teachers. No charges were ever brought against Bev regarding any of this, and there was no court hearing because Susan, probably under pressure from her mum, agreed not to press any charges against her stepfather. And this abuse actually continued 6 months, up until 6 months before the events of today's case. So the only reason it stops is because she got sent to jail, basically. And keep in mind that she had kids and a husband. In the summer of 1988, between her junior and senior years of high school, Susan began working at Winn-Dixie supermarket in Union. Susan's first job was as a cashier, but within 6 months, she was promoted to head cashier and later promoted again and became the market's bookkeeper. At the beginning of her senior year in high school, Susan began to secretly date one of her co-workers from Winn-Dixie, an older married man. Shortly after this relationship with this co-worker began, Susan became pregnant and then decided to have an abortion. At the same time that this relationship was going on, Susan was also dating another co-worker. After the abortion, the older married co-worker found out about the other relationship and ended his relationship with Susan, even though he was married. Susan became deeply depressed over the breakup. In early November 1988, she attempted to commit suicide by taking an overdose of aspirin and Tylenol. Susan was admitted to the Spartanburg Regional Medical Center on November 7th, 1988, and remained hospitalized there for 1 week. During this hospitalization, her doctors found out and realized about that suicide attempt she'd made once before at age 13. Susan spent months recovering from this suicide attempt, and the managers at Winn-Dixie were supportive and allowed Susan to return to her job once she was ready. Prior to her suicide attempt, Susan had become friendly with David Smith, one of the stock clerks at Winn-Dixie. Susan knew David because they had attended Union High School together at the same time. During the time Susan was involved in her 2 relationships with them 2 co-workers, David was dating his longtime girlfriend, Christy Jennings. David Smith was born on July 27th, 1970. He was the second of 3 children born to Barbara and Charles David Smith. Charles Smith was also called David and was a Navy veteran who had served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. Barbara Smith was a devout Jehovah's Witness who sheltered David from many outside influences during his childhood. His parents' marriage was troubled. Over the years of their marriage, David's father grew a dislike of how religious David's mother was. As David grew older, he found the strict religious practices of his mother's religion and its insistence on isolation from the larger community distasteful. When David was 17, he moved out. He wanted to distance himself from his mother and he moved into his great-grandmother's house. During the summer of 1990, David and Susan began to date. Although at the time, David was actually engaged to that longtime girlfriend, Christy Jennings. David at the time viewed his relationship with Susan as not really serious, just casual. In January 1991, after dating for around a year, keep in mind he's also engaged, Susan found out she was pregnant. David told Christy about Susan and Christy broke off this relationship with David immediately. David and Susan decided to get married because they were both against Susan having an abortion. Although marriage represented safety and stability to Susan, it also meant that she would have to give up her plans to attend college. She did desire to go to college, but she didn't really know what she wanted to do, but now she wasn't going to go. This is all happening very quick. I'm assuming they just thought they had to get married because obviously she was pregnant. In their own ways, Susan and David were emotionally needy people who found comfort in each other at the beginning of their relationship with their similarities with each other. They seemed to fulfill the other's needs emotionally. However, the relationship was filled with many stresses and strains. I mean, obviously they didn't even know each other and they were already having a baby. Susan and David's backgrounds were very different and it also caused friction between them. David was raised in the country and Susan was raised in the city. In Union, the city kids like Susan would look down on country kids like David. Susan's mother and stepfather, Bev, were not pleased by the news of Susan's pregnancy and marriage. I mean, she's so young, like they wouldn't be. Susan's mother was disappointed that David did not have a college education and was not from the same economic background as Susan. On March 4th, 1991, David's older brother died of complications from Crohn's disease. 11 days later, on the March 5th, 1991, Susan and David married at the Union Methodist Church in Bougainville. Susan was 19 and 2 months pregnant. David was 20. Even though David's family were literally dealing with the death of Danny, their son, David's brother, Susan's mother Linda insisted that the wedding go forward as scheduled because she was concerned that Susan's pregnancy would start to show before the wedding could take place. David had worked hard for a few years on renovating a small house located on the same property as his great-grandmother's house, and Susan had agreed to live there when the two got married, and she was happy with this. However, when Linda and Bev went to visit this house, they obviously put Susan off of it a bit, and it was now a tin-roofed country shack in Susan's eyes, and she didn't want to live there now, so they lived in Mona's house. It's called M-O-N-E-R-S house. I wasn't really sure what this means. I'm guessing one of their families owned it from my research, but they didn't end up living in this built house. Susan worked at Winn-Dixie until she went into labour. Their first son, Michael Daniel Smith, was born on October 10th, 1991, at Mary Black Hospital in Spartanburg. Michael's middle name was chosen in honour of David's brother Danny. After Michael's birth, Susan continued to work part-time at Winn-Dixie and enrolled in several college courses at the branch of the University of South Carolina in Union. Early in their marriage, David and Susan felt a great deal of tension, and the tension and trouble was no surprise to their friends. In Union, it was customary for young people to marry after finishing high school and begin to have children straight away. Young couples often found themselves with demands and responsibilities that exceeded their expectations of married life. One of the areas that caused tension between the two was money. According to David, Susan was always interested in material things. Susan also worried about paying the bills and often asked her mother for loans. This obviously angered David. David and Susan did earn a fairly good income though. David was on about $22,000 a year and Susan earned about $17,000 a year. Another area of tension in their marriage was Susan's mum, Linda. Her and David did not get on. Linda was very controlling and would often visit their house without giving any warning. She would offer unsolicited advice about how David and Susan were raising their son Michael and how to deal with their marriage issues. According to David, Susan seemed to always follow what her mum Linda said. Another stress on their marriage was the fact that they were both still working at Winn-Dixie, and David was actually Susan's boss. Yeah, that cannot be good. Another problem was their extramarital affairs. By their third wedding anniversary, David and Susan had already separated several times. David would move between their house and his family house frequently. During their first separation in March 1992, shortly after their 1-year anniversary, Susan rekindled a relationship with a former boyfriend at Winn-Dixie, and this angered David, obviously, because they are married. During another separation in the summer of 1992, Susan and Michael lived at Linda and Bev's house, and David and Susan tried to mend their relationship, and throughout 1992, David and Susan's relationship seesawed back and forth. Susan then became pregnant with their second child in November 1992, and in that December, they tried to give it a go, living under the same roof again. And Susan told David that the only chance of their marriage succeeding was if they had their own home. So this is what confuses me, but anyway, they bought a small ranch-style home with dark red shutters at 407 Tony Road in Union, and Bev and Linda provided the down payment. Susan's second pregnancy was not as happy as her first, with Michael. David remembered that Susan complained non-stop about being fat and ugly, which is natural. Slowly, Susan began to shut David out of her life. She complained about the physical aspects of their relationship and stopped sharing anecdotes about their son Michael. David became lonely and wanted someone to talk to. So in June 1993, David began a relationship with a cashier at Winn-Dixie, Tiffany Moss. Susan and Tiffany had actually attended high school together at the same time, but they were not friends, however they did know each other. Susan was very jealous, and employees remembered incidents where Susan would visit David and scream at him when she saw David talking to women in the store. I mean, she was pregnant. Susan and David's second son, Alexander Tyler, was born on August 5th, 1993. Susan had an emergency C-section. After Alex's birth, Susan and David put aside their differences for a short time in order to settle their new baby at home and allow Susan to recover. But within 3 weeks of Alex's birth, Susan and David decided their relationship was over, and David moved out of the house and he went back to their first, Mona's house. Although Susan and David's marriage was troubled and headed for divorce, by all accounts, the pair were devoted parents who doted on their children. After recovering from Alex's birth, Susan found a new job at Conso Products because she decided she couldn't return to Winn-Dixie Dixie, as she would have to be working for David, and obviously they were separated, and also she didn't want to be seeing his new girlfriend Tiffany Moss around. Susan was hired as a bookkeeper at Conso Products and eventually became the assistant to the executive secretary. Susan really enjoyed working here, she liked the responsibilities, and she was exposed to elements of the expensive lifestyle that was foreign to her. She also enjoyed working at Conso for another reason. Tom Findlay, a 27-year-old who had grown up in the upscale suburb of Birmingham, Alabama. Tom was responsible for designing and producing Conso's brochures. He was very popular with young women in Union because he was young, rich and available. Conso also provided Susan with a new group of friends, and she spent a lot of time socialising with them at Union's only bar, they only had one bar, called Hickory Nuts. During Susan and David's last separation before Susan filed for divorce, Tom Findlay and Susan began to date. Beginning in January 1994 for a period of several months, Susan and Tom frequently met for lunch or went to the movies. Susan would visit Tom at his cottage on his father's estate and attended several parties thrown by Tom here. During the spring and early summer of 1994, Susan and David tried one final time to make their marriage work. Oh my god, you think they'd just give up at this point. David moved back to the home and stopped seeing Tiffany. During this time, Susan and Tom had broken off their relationship as well. At the end of July 1994, Susan told David that she wanted a divorce. David was sad because of this, as he wanted the marriage to work, especially because he thought that his boys needed their parents together. In August, David moved out and rented a 2-bedroom apartment in the Lakeside Gardens complex, about 2 miles from the house that Susan, Michael and Alex lived on in Tony Road. At the beginning of September 1994, Susan began to believe that her life was finally settling down. She and David had a very amicable relationship centred on taking care of their 2 sons, and Susan was beginning to believe that her dreams of love and stability might come true with Tom Findlay, who she began to date again. However, Tom had different ideas. Tom liked Susan, but he ended their relationship because he began to feel that Susan was too possessive and needy. On September 21st, 1994, Susan's attorneys served divorce papers on David. Susan sought a divorce on the grounds of adultery, so cheating, but I don't really know. He wasn't very happy with this. The autumn of 1994 had been full of activity for Susan. She worked full-time at Conso, managed a part-time college course at university, had custody of her 2 toddler sons, and was sexually involved with 3 men. Bev Russell, her stepfather, still, Tom Findlay, even though I'm pretty sure they'd broken up, and her ex-husband David, still. Increasingly, Susan was filled with anxiety when she was alone, and she became depressed all of a sudden. During this period of time, Susan had begun to take days off from work to drink, and this was very unusual behaviour for her. Tuesday, October 25th, 1994. This day began like any other day for Susan Smith. Susan dressed and fed her children breakfast and drove them to daycare. She went to work and at lunch joined a group of Conso employees, one of them which was Tom Findlay, at a restaurant in Buffalo. While the group laughed and talked, Susan just sat quietly. At around 1:30 p.m, Susan asked her supervisor, Sandy Williams, if she could leave work early. Sandy asked Susan if something was wrong, and Susan confided in Sandy that she was upset because she was, quote, in love with someone who doesn't love me. Sandy asked Susan who the person was, and she replied Tom Findlay, but it can never be because of my children, which I was a bit confused. I'm guessing he didn't want to date someone that had children, or maybe that's just the reason he said to her. So remember, so her children are kind of getting in the way of her relationship in her eyes. At around 2:30 p.m, Susan called Tom in his office to ask him to meet her outside of the building to talk. Susan told Tom that David was threatening to expose and make public some embarrassing information about her in the divorce proceedings. She also, in this encounter, told Tom about her sexual relationship with her stepfather. I'm not sure why she did that, but Tom told Susan that their friendship would remain intact, but their intimate relationship will have to stop forever. At 4:30 p.m, Susan sought out Tom again in the Conso photography studio. Susan attempted to return a sweatshirt that she had borrowed, but Tom refused to accept it and told her she can keep it. I mean, she's literally obsessed with Tom, like she's trying to get his attention constantly. After Susan collected her sons from daycare, Susan headed into her car to Hickory Nuts. While she was driving there, she spotted Sue Brown, who was the marketing manager at Conso, in her car. Both Sue and Susan pulled up into the Hickory Nuts parking lot. Susan talked to Sue Brown and convinced her to return to Conso with her so that she could apologise to Tom for lying about her sleeping with her father. Susan had concocted this story in order to see his reaction, but we all know this wasn't true, but she's obviously thinking, oh god, like why have I told him that? I need to tell him it's a lie now. They arrived at Conso at around 5:30 p.m. Susan wanted Sue to watch her children while she spoke to Tom. Tom was not happy to see Susan and quickly led her out of his office. Susan told Sue Brown that she was upset after talking to Tom and that she may just end it, even though he'd already ended it. Sandy Williams, that manager, was leaving work for the day when she spotted Susan Smith and Sue Brown in the parking lot. Sandy felt manipulated and deceived by Susan, who had insisted that she could not stay at work and had to go home because she was so upset by her boyfriend's rejection. Susan dropped Sue Brown off at Hickory Nuts and drove home. This was at about 6 p.m. Later in the evening, Sue Brown was eating dinner at Hickory Nuts with several friends, including Tom. During the meal, a waiter brought a cordless telephone over to Sue. It was Susan calling to ask Sue if Tom had asked about her. Sue told Susan that no, he'd not asked about her. She is so obsessed. At 8 p.m, Susan dressed her sons, placed them in their car seats in the car, and began driving around Union. Susan later described her reaction to Tom's rejection by saying that she had never felt so lonely and sad in her entire life. Around 9 p.m, a lady called Shirley McLeod was relaxing in the living room of her home, located about 1/4 of a mile from John D. Long Lake. Shirley was just finishing Tuesday's Union Daily Times when she heard a wailing coming from her front porch. Shirley switched on the porch light and saw a young woman sobbing hysterically. The young woman cried, "Please help me. He's got my kids and he's got my car." Shirley led Susan into her house and Susan told her that a black man has got my kids and my car. Shirley's husband told his son to call 911. At 9:12 p.m, the 911 dispatcher called the sheriff's office to direct them to respond to the call. Once Susan had calmed down, Shirley asked Susan to tell her what happened. Susan told her the following story, quote, "I was stopped at the red light at Monarch Mills and a black man jumped in and told me to drive. I asked him why he was doing this and he said, 'Shut up and drive or I'll kill you.'" Susan continued and told Shirley that at the abductor's direction, she drove northeast of Union for about 4 miles until we made her stop just past the stop sign. This sign was for the John D. Long Lake, which was located several hundred yards outside of Shirley's front door. Susan continued, quote, "He told me to get out. He made me stop in the middle of the road. Nobody was coming, not a single car. I asked him, why can't I take my kids?" And apparently this man said, "I don't have time." Susan said the man pushed her out of the car while he was pointing a gun at her side. Susan then said, quote, "When he finally got me out, he said, 'Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt your kids.'" Susan described how she had laid on the ground as the man drove away as both of her sons cried out for their mother. After a while, Susan wasn't sure how long, she began to run and stopped when she reached Shirley's porch. Susan asked Shirley if she could use her bathroom to call her mother. When Susan was unable to reach her mother, she called her stepfather and then her husband, David. Keep in mind they're separated, but he's still her husband. By the time Susan reached David by the phone, the Union County Sheriff, Howard Wells, had already driven to Shirley's home and was directing the search for the Smith children. Obviously, Shirley had been alarmed by Susan, obviously, so she'd already called the police, the McLeod household. Sheriff Wells actually knew Susan already through Susan's brother, and Wells asked Susan to repeat her story, although he'd already heard it from the 911 dispatcher and from Shirley. Wells took notes and asked Susan questions. Susan's face was red and puffy and she had her hands rested in her lap. Susan described the clothes that her sons were wearing. Michael was wearing a white jogging suit and Alex was wearing a red and white striped outfit. After Susan finished, Wells realised that the carjacking was not going to be solved quickly, nor could the Union County Sheriff's Office have all the resources necessary to find the children. Wells called Chief Robert Stewart, the head of South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known by the initials SLED, SLED, for additional assistance, and they helped a big part in this case. Obviously, at this point, Wells did not question any of the things that Susan told him. Like, why would he think she's making this up? Really? Like, Like, he knew her already as well, so he probably did trust her even more. But he just wouldn't question it, obviously. He just wanted to collect the available information and then see what leads he could follow. Deputies continued searching for the children and for Susan's Mazda car, because obviously he took the car. While Susan, David and their families gathered at the McLeod's home, Shirley's house. I mean, this Shirley seems like a great woman, just saying. Like, she seems great. Around midnight, Sheriff Wells suggested that Susan and her family go find another meeting place, and Susan volunteered up her mother's home. So they all went, and friends of theirs left the McLeods for Bev and Linda's home. Susan rode with David in his car. On the way, Susan told David that Tom Findlay might come and see her and that she didn't want David to become angry. David found Susan's statement absolutely crazy in light of the fact that their sons are missing right now. It seemed that Susan was more worried about how David would react about Tom than worrying about finding their sons, which is crazy. Wells returned to his office and began to sort out the investigation. Divers were sent over to John D. Long Lake to search, and a helicopter with heat sensors flew over the lake as well, and the nearby Summer National Forest. Divers who searched the lake did not find anything at the bottom, and obviously Wells wanted to get a better description of this kidnapper Susan was describing, so they arranged for a police sketch to be made by an artist for a composite drawing. The police artist met with Susan and, using the description she provided, composed a sketch of a black man around 40 years of age wearing a dark knit cap, a dark shirt, jeans and a plaid jacket. Very random. Throughout the next day, October 26th, 1994, more searches took place, and they obviously were conducting interviews of everyone, including Shirley and the McLeod family, that house that Susan turned up to. Later in the afternoon, Margaret Frierson, executive director of the Adam Walsh Centre, which is an organisation that became involved. They helped with like missing children. They spoke to Susan's sister-in-law, Wendy, who was married to Susan's brother, and Margaret offered the centre's assistance to David and Susan. Margaret told Wendy that she would need to speak to Susan and David and asked that they call her back. They never did. Instead, Bev Russell called Margaret later the same day and provided directions to the home. Before driving to Union, Margaret and her assistant, Charlotte Foster, obtained pictures of the boys and arranged for flyers to be printed describing the missing boys. Susan and David continued to stay at Linda and Bev's home. Susan never spent a moment alone. Obviously, people thought she was, which probably was it's a tricky one. Tom Findlay called Susan and expressed his sympathies about her two missing boys. Susan shifted the topic of conversation away from her missing children and to her relationship with him. Tom told Susan not to worry about the relationship and to concentrate on her own children. The telephone call would be the only one that Susan would receive from Tom, and even when Sue Brown came to visit and her ex-colleagues, Susan literally asked her when Tom was planning to visit her, but he never did. Margaret Frierson and Charlotte Foster arrived at the Russell home, Linda and Bev's home, on the afternoon of that next day, the 26th. Instead of talking to Susan and David alone, as they would have preferred, the women met with Susan, David and Bev, Linda and Scotty, remember Susan's brother. Margaret explained why the Adam Walsh Centre was founded and what services it could provide for the parents of missing children. It was explained that Margaret and Charlotte could act as the family's liaison with the news media and could arrange and schedule interviews and broadcast pictures of their sons and information about the crime. After 40 minutes, Susan and David excused themselves from this conversation and drove to the sheriff's office for interviews. Well, Susan especially seemed to have no interest in Margaret's offer, which I just don't really get. Well, I do, but should have not made sense to them. Sheriff Wells questioned Susan in his office, and Margaret and SLED investigator Eddie Harris spoke with David about how he could make a plea for the safe return of his sons to the news media, which is very common in cases like this. They believed it would be so important, and David was nervous but has agreed that it was important to do anything he could do to return his sons. David, with Susan by his side, stood on the steps of the Union County Sheriff's Department and made the following statement, quote, "To whoever has our boys, we ask that you please don't hurt them and bring them back. We love them very much. I plead to the guy, please return our children to us safe and unharmed. Everywhere I look, I see their play toys and pictures. They are both wonderful children. I don't know how else to put it, and I can't imagine life without them. Breaks my heart, and the fact Susan was standing there with him. After he finished, he and Susan went back to the office, and Susan was questioned by many different investigators for 6 hours, and obviously she was asked on multiple occasions to repeat her story. 2 days after the carjacking, on Thursday, October 27th, 1994, both David and Susan submitted to polygraph tests. David's came back, he passed, and Susan's were inconclusive. And her test showed greatest levels of deception when she was asked the question, quote, do you know where your children are? Susan told David that she thought she had done not very well on this test, and she warned David that she thought the police may not believe her story anymore because she didn't think this lie detector test went well. And this would be the first of many polygraph tests Susan would be given and then would fail or be inconclusive. Now, there were several inconsistencies in Susan's story. Over the course of the day, Agent Caldwell interviewed Susan on 3 separate occasions. He asked Susan to recount the details of her whole day when the kidnapping happened. Susan told him she had called her mother after she came home from work to ask if she could visit her later that evening. Susan's mother told her that she had other plans and would not be at home. Susan then made dinner for her sons, but they were fussy and did not want to eat. David called Susan during the time she was preparing dinner and later told the police that he could hear his sons in the background and that they seemed fussy. Susan told Agent Caldwell that at 7:30 p.m. Michael told her that he wanted to go to Walmart. Susan told him they drove to Foster Park and stayed until 8:40 p.m. but did not get out of the car. Susan then claimed she returned to the Walmart parking lot because of the bright light so that she could search for Alex's bottle he dropped on the floor out of the car. Susan then told him that Michael had suggested visiting Mitchell Sinclair, who was the fiance of her best friend Donna Garner. Very random, but apparently her son wanted to see him. But then she amended this answer when she was questioned further about it. And then agents told Susan that they had spoken to Mitchell and that he had not been aware of any visit at all. And the investigators had visited Walmart and had spoken to many people who were working or shopping in the store that evening, and they never recalled seeing Susan or her 2 sons. Susan then backpedaled away from her story and said she had actually just been driving around for hours with her 2 children strapped in the car seats. Susan had not said anything about this to investigators because she was afraid that this made her look suspicious. So she's getting stuck now. She's digging a hole deeper. After interviewing Susan on October 26th, investigators became suspicious of her story. Now, remember I said she told them that she stopped at the red light. So, the light at the Monarch intersection is permanently green unless a car on the cross street triggers the signal to switch. If there had been no other cars on the road that night, the light would not have been red like she said. So that's... ugh. David also met with the investigators and they asked him if she'd been dating anyone, and obviously David said yep, Tom Finlay, and then he got some information, and then Agent Caldwell told Susan that investigators had obtained information that Susan had a boyfriend, Tom, and that Tom had broken off his relationship because of Susan's sons. Then he asked Susan, quote, did this fact play any role or have any bearing on the disappearances of your children? Susan replied, quote, no man would make me hurt my children. They were my life. Now, this answer indicated that she thought her sons were no longer alive. They were my life. Keep in mind, she only thinks they've been kidnapped right now. This isn't a murder investigation. This is a search for her sons. And she's talking about them in complete past tense. Later in that day, when Susan was interviewed again, she was confronted again by the inconsistencies in her story. Agent Caldwell demanded to know why Susan had not told the truth about Walmart. He asked Susan about her children's fussiness and asked Susan, quote, is that why you killed them? Susan slammed her fist on the table and said, quote, you son of a bitch, how could you think that? Susan got up from her chair and left the office where the interview was taking place, yelling, I can't believe you think I did it. Caldwell noted that from time to time during his interview with Susan, she would sob but tears would not come out. The FBI agent who administered the polygraph test on October 27th noted that Susan made, quote, fake sounds of crying with no tears in her eyes. Another person who thought Susan was lying about the carjacking was the forensic artist Roy Pascal, who had drawn the sketch of the carjacker from her description. He felt that Susan was very vague in her description, but she was very specific about some of the small details. Sheriff Wells contacted the FBI's Behavioural Scientists Unit for assistance. They asked the unit to provide a profile of characteristics of a homicidal mother, and what was provided fit Susan almost perfectly. The FBI's profile described a woman in her 20s who grew up or lived in poverty, was undereducated, had a history of either physical or sexual abuse or both, remained isolated from social supports, had depressive and suicidal tendencies, and was usually experienced rejection from a male lover. This profile also explained how the mother might also find herself enmeshed with her children and show an inability to define her boundaries as separate from her children. During a homicidal act, the mother may view a child as a mere extension of herself rather than as a separate being. The mother's suicidal feelings then may turn to murder on their child as an extension of themselves, because they see that as themselves. There were more searches of that lake, but they came up empty-handed again every time. Sheriff Wells held a press conference to announce that he had no solid clues in the kidnapping of Michael and Alec, and that he also had not ruled out any suspects, including Susan and David themselves. Wells also stated that the investigators had uncovered several discrepancies in Susan's statements. Wells said, quote, "We do not have a car, we do not have the children, we do not have a suspect." There was another issue surrounding the disappearance of the boys that caused a greater amount of speculation. The fact that Susan claimed the carjacker was a black man. Many in the black community found that Susan's story lacked credibility. They found it impossible that a black man would go unnoticed driving around with two white children, especially given the intensity surrounding this search for the children. Among the media that was attracted to this case was the television programme American Journal. The producers of American Journal asked Mark Klaas, the father of Polly Klaas, a 12-year-old girl who was kidnapped from her bedroom and murdered in 1993, to report on the boy's disappearance. Klaas had previously reported on 3 other cases of missing children for the television programme. After his daughter's murder, he became an advocate for children, which is amazing. When his daughter was kidnapped, Mark met with Jeanne Boyton, a cognitive graphic artist, who actually sketched the drawing that then led them to find who killed his daughter, and after they'd stayed in touch. So Mark contacted Jeanne again, or Jean, I'm going to say Jean. And when Jean saw this drawing of the black man, she felt that if Susan had really been carjacked, a far more detailed drawing of the suspect would have been produced. Mark Klaas then suggested that Jean join him in going to Union. The pair arrived in Union on Friday, October 28th. As they approached the Russell home where Susan was staying, Margaret Gregory, the wife of one of Susan's cousins, told them that Susan had no interest in meeting with them. Jean could not understand why Susan did not want to meet with them, because she'd worked in over 7,000 criminal cases and she felt she understood what type of behaviour was typical and what wasn't. And Susan's refusal to see them was really not typical. Why wouldn't she want their help? Jean then went to the sheriff's office in Union. She met with FBI agents, SLED investigators and Union County sheriffs and explained her criticism on the original drawing of the carjacker. She explained how the positioning in the drawing was incorrect, how the suspect was devoid of emotion, and how the drawing was of a person that was very passive. Remember, she's an complete expert. It was here she learned that the FBI agents and Sheriff Wells also did not believe Susan. Jean then tried to meet with Susan on her own, but was again told Susan was not interested, which is so weird. After 4 days of trying to talk to Susan and David, Jean and Mark gave up and went home. They left convinced that Susan was involved in the disappearance of her children. However, they did not believe that Susan had harmed her children. Instead, they thought that the Smiths were involved in a custody battle and that Susan had hidden her children from David, which, if only that was the case, seriously. By 6 days of the boys' disappearance, the chief of SLED, Agent David Caldwell, the behavioural specialist, and the FBI agents working on the case all had concluded on their own and together as a group that Susan was definitely lying about her involvement in the disappearance of her own children. The investigators now faced the challenge of proving Susan's involvement in the crime. They continued to interview Susan on a daily basis. Gradually, they began to suggest to her that they wanted to believe her story, but they just couldn't. Back when Agent Caldwell had accused Susan of murdering her children during an interview, Susan's reaction shocked the investigators. The quiet passive, semi-hysterical woman who continually repeated, "God look after my babies," suddenly became angry and lashed out at the investigators. From Susan's response, investigators learned that Susan was not just a broken-hearted mother, but a strong-willed woman, and that they would have a difficult time getting her to confess. There was literally nothing the investigators could prove yet, which must have been so frustrating, but all the details of Susan's story, the red light at the Monarch Mills intersection, the absence of cars on the road, the conflicting stories about where Susan was heading that night, and the fact that Susan's car had vanished. This all made investigators seriously doubt her. The issue that most nagged at investigators was Susan's car. Very early in the investigation, they felt that Susan was culpable of the crime and that she acted alone. But where was Susan's car? Investigators felt that the car and the two children were within walking distance of that lake. They returned again to search for the car in a more broad search. The investigators believed that if they could build Susan's trust in them, they could coax her into confessing. But they were careful not to push her too much because they knew her history of depression and suicide attempts, and they didn't want her to just shut down or even commit suicide. Obviously, the investigators all hoped that these boys would be found safely, but as the days passed, it wasn't becoming likely. Agent Caldwell had obtained information from Tom Findlay, who had met with the investigators at the beginning of the investigation. Tom told the investigators that Susan had reacted vindictively to his rejection, and he was surprised at how bitter she was acting. The investigators used this information and their own observation of Susan's angry outbursts when confronted with their early suspicions to develop a possible motive, and that motive was that greed and ambition had pushed Susan to rid herself of her children by murdering them. On Thursday, November 3rd, 1994, the 9th day since the carjacking and disappearance of the boys, Susan and David rose early to prepare themselves for interviews on 3 different television networks. Susan and David sat together holding hands during their interviews. On CBS this morning, Susan was asked if she had any involvement in her son's disappearance. Susan answered the question by saying, quote, "I did not have anything to do with the abduction of my children. Whoever did this is sick and an emotionally unstable person." And although David and Susan were legally separated, when David was asked whether he believed his wife, he replied, "Yes, I believe my wife totally." And I'm sure he did. At 12:30 p.m, Susan was taken for yet another interrogation, and she was beginning to be worn down by the intensive and lengthy questions. And at 1:40 p.m, Sheriff Wells and Susan met in a small room in the family centre of the First Baptist Church. Sheriff Wells confronted Susan about her story of the carjacking. He told Susan he knew that her story of this black carjacker was a lie. He told her about the facts that she could not stop at the red light, and all of the facts that were really mentioned. He confronted Susan about these, and after he'd told her all of this, Susan asked him to pray with her. And at the close of their prayers, Wells said, quote, "Lord, we know that all things will be revealed to us in time." Wells then looked over at Susan and said, quote, "Susan, it's time." Susan then dropped her head and wailed, quote, "I am so ashamed, I am so ashamed." She asked Sheriff Wells for his gun so that she could kill herself. Sheriff Wells asked Susan why she wanted to do that, and Susan replied, quote, "You don't understand, my children are not alright." Susan then told Wells about the crushing isolation she felt that night while driving along Highway 49 on October 25th, and the consuming desire she had to commit suicide. Susan had planned to drive her sons to her mother's house, but emotionally she felt so bad that she didn't think her mother could even help her. She told Wells that her whole life had felt wrong and that she could not escape the loneliness, isolation and failure that completely took over her. Susan collapsed and began to sob, and other investigators entered the room to obtain her written confession. In her confession, Susan filled 2 pages with carefully written script, rounding off her letter and drawing little hearts whenever she wanted to use the word heart. Susan wrote that she had driven off Highway 49 and onto the road leading to John D. Long Lake because she wanted to commit suicide. She believed her children would be better off without her, and better off with God if they were left without a mother and alone. Her plan was that the 3 of them, herself and her 2 boys, Michael and Alex, would all die together. She said that she had tried to end all of their lives by putting the car in neutral and letting it roll down the boat ramp, but she pulled on the parking brake and stopped the car. She did this 3 times before she stood outside the car, overcome with grief, loneliness and pain, reached into the car, and then released the brakes, sending the car into the lake with just the sons in, not her. During her confession, she told investigators how much she loved her sons and that she never meant to harm them and that she was sorry. Yeah, because that helps. After the car had rolled into the lake, Susan wanted to undo what she'd done, but she could not. And then obviously, as she ran towards the McLeod's house, she planned her alibi. She said that keeping her secret during the 9 days her son was assumed to be kidnapped was very difficult, that watching her parents and David hurt her very deeply. Susan said that she was scared, but admitted that she thought she would be found out and that her story would not withstand scrutiny. I mean, if you thought that, then just say it then. Obviously now divers were sent back to that John D. Long Lake, and 6 minutes into their second dive they located the underside of the upside down Mazda, Susan's car, and the boys were found inside the car in their car seats hanging upside down. Sheriff Wells flew in a waiting helicopter to the Russells' home to inform David and Susan's parents that Michael and Alex had been found. Unfortunately, the family had already heard an unconfirmed report that Susan had confessed to murdering her children. He told the family members and friends assembled at the home portions of what Susan had told him. He also told them that Susan had been arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. The bodies of the poor boys, Michael and Alex, were placed in a waiting ambulance that was then driven to the University of South Carolina Medical Center. Autopsies were performed on November 4th and confirmed that the children had been alive when their mother sent them into the lake and that they had drowned as the car submerged. The funeral for the boys, little Michael and Alex, was held on Sunday, November 6th at Buffalo Methodist Church. Funeral was preceded by a visitation on Saturday, November 5th. The casket remained closed during the funeral and visitation because of the water damage done on their bodies. Michael and Alex were buried together in a white casket with gold trim during a private ceremony in the cemetery behind the Bogensville United Methodist Church, next to the grave of Danny Smith, David's older brother, and their uncle that they never got to meet. After Susan was arrested for the murders of Michael and Alex, she was held without bail at York County Jail, and her trial began on July 10th, 1995. This trial actually started pretty quick. It was meant to start on July 10th, but I'm pretty sure that was like getting the jury together and stuff like that, but it actually started properly. I'm about to go into that. So opening statements began on Wednesday, July 19th, 1995. Special prosecutor Keith Gies began his opening statement by stating the facts of the prosecution's case. For 9 days in the fall of 1994, Susan Smith looked this country in the eye and lied. She begged God to return her children to safety, and the whole time she knew her children were lying dead at the bottom of the John D. Long Lake. He continued by telling jurors that the boys died because their mother thought she could reclaim Tom Finley, a lover who had discarded her. Towards the end of his statement, he told the jurors that this is a case of selfishness, of I and me. He concluded his statement by asking jurors to hold on to their common sense in the weeks ahead of this trial, because they would come to see Susan Smith as a selfish, manipulative killer who sacrificed her children for a rich guy. The prosecution's case was based on the theory that Susan wanted to escape her loneliness, unhappiness and the stresses of her new life by establishing an excitement, intimate relationship with her wealthy boyfriend, and in order to do this she would need to free herself of her children and the demands of motherhood. The defence's opening statement was given by Judy Clark, who asked the jurors to look into their hearts and through that softer focus find a disturbed, childlike figure who, after a lifetime of sadness, just snapped, no, saying that Susan was deeply depressed and had a sense of failure in her life. Yet so do so many people. They don't do this. This sense of failure included acts of sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, the suicide of her real father, and her own suicide attempts, which, yes, is awful, but all of these events apparently contributed to pushing her to the edge of the lake to kill herself and children, but didn't kill herself, just the children. Very weird. And apparently at the last second her body wheeled itself out of the car and she lived and the toddlers died. The defense attorneys believed that by portraying Susan as a person with emotional problems, this could save her at least from the electric chair. They knew this was going to be a slam dunk case because they literally had a written confession, but they were trying to get her off of the death penalty. Susan's defense attorneys did not claim she was insane or had any mental illness or anything, but just the bad childhood. At 7:55 p.m, after deliberating for 2.5 hours, the jury returned on a verdict of guilty of 2 counts of murder. As the verdict was read, Susan bowed her head in tears and trembled. The jury appeared to have agreed with the prosecutors, who argued that Susan knew what she was doing when she released the emergency brake on the car, allowing it to roll into the lake with only her sons trapped in there, not her. And then when the sentencing happened, during the sentencing, the jury returned with a decision after deliberating for 2.5 hours again. The jury rejected the prosecution's request for a sentence of death for Susan and decided instead that Susan should spend the rest of her natural life in prison. Judge Howard then sentenced Susan Smith to 30 years to life in prison. Susan will be eligible for parole in 2025, yep, next year, after she's served 30 years in prison, because that's obviously the minimum. At that time, Susan will only be 53 years old. She can start a whole new life again. Is that an actual joke? I actually can't go over that. Sorry, what? She can start a whole new life. I hate 30 to life in prison. No, it should just be life. End of. Oh my God. This case. Wow, it's just like, there's no, oh, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And I feel heartbroken for them, the boys' dad. I feel heartbroken. And I just want to remember the beautiful boys, Michael and Alex. I can't even imagine what their other family members went through. It breaks my heart. She took their whole lives away from 2 toddlers and they were so little. Anyway, that was a heavy one. I hope you found this an interesting case to listen to, and it's a bizarre one. I've never read anything quite as crazy as this, and it's the fact that she never struggled with parenthood. So this is not a case of like postpartum depression. It all seemed very all of a sudden towards the sons. I really would love to go deep into the psychology with this woman. Sick woman, sick. And the fact she could be coming out next year. Oh, anyway, please leave your thoughts and discuss stuff in the comments. It would mean the world to me. And give this a thumbs up, share it and subscribe because I love you all. And yeah, I'll see you all on Tuesday for a new video.